The purchasing tools part of the professional service tools suite covers using the 1099 modifier. The 1099 modifier is a very, very important tool inside the system. And how this works is if you choose to come down and modify your 1099s, how this is used on a day-to-day basis. If a person came in and created a new vendor, and did not set them up as a 1099 vendor, and then maybe 3 or 4 or 5 months later they decided they're doing a lot of business with that vendor and they've exceeded the threshold of $600 to be reportable as a 1099 vendor, they can come back in and process a 1099 and update all of the payables transactions to reflect the reflect this vendor as being a 1099 vendor, and it can be multiple vendors. So you can process the report and print at the same time using this radio button, or you can just print the report only. But if you do the report only, you'll get a report of the vendors that should be considered for 1099. So here in this case, here's the 1099 applied amount, and there's multiple vendors here, multiple vouchers I should say, that qualify for being a 1099 vendor. So at this point, now if you've got the report, then you can say, well great, I want to go ahead and process and create the 1099s for, not create the 1099, but create the record inside the system that reflects all those invoices have been signed and will be reportable for 1099 purposes at the end of the year. Very simple process, but very huge time saver inside the system. The next purchasing tool is what they call the Payables Master Record Triggers. Again, triggers meaning copy. So a person would come in and launch the professional tools and go to the master trigger, and as they do so, this is going to launch the screen that allows a person to copy the master records for the vendors from one database to another. So again, it sets up a test environment in a new database so you can do some what-if scenarios and tinker to your heart's content without affecting your main system. So that is your, take that off. That is your Payables Master Record Trigger. The next tool is the Payables Minimum Check. The Payables Minimum Check is set up in such a way that there's a little box to the side of the minimum check, and if I do click the radio button, the next icon goes away because it's not a process similar to what we've been showing. It's a setting, it's a setup inside of the dynamic system. So how that works is if I go to GP and I get ready to do a check run, and I select checks out of the system, purchasing, select checks, you're going to see at the top of the screen an additional field, and this is called Set Minimum Check. So what this means, if I set my minimum check to be $25 and I do a check run, if there's a check for $1 or $5, anything less than $25, it will not print a check out of the system. This remains in effect. If you want to turn it off, you just unclick the little button here and it turns it off, but it remains hard-coded with a professional tool in the system unless it's changed by you as you do a select check payables run. The select checks combiner, what this does, you notice it has just a little check mark again, so it's all behind the scenes, and I'll just talk about this instead of doing it. But if you do transactions, you go to purchasing and you select checks, and you've gone through the whole process. And I just did a select check, and I built the build, and I've got $19,000 in here, but I want to add to the batch. But in this first build, I chose a vendor and the vendor was, say, A1 Travel. And I insert that and add that to the batch. As I continue adding vendor and my batch increases in size, I might have, during the process, selected multiple times a single vendor. So what that feature does in the purchasing series, it combines all of the multiple selects into a single check. So instead of getting multiple checks out of a run, you'll get one check with multiple invoices on the check. The next tool is called the Vendor Combiner. The Vendor Combiner allows you as an individual to combine vendors, and so if I pull up the Vendor Combiner here and I hit the next, I can say I've got a vendor here and the vendor is Advanced Office Machines, and I want to combine all that activity into a new vendor called Allenson Properties. Then I just hit the convert and away we go. So what this does from a historical standpoint, it takes all, it might be appropriate when some vendor has been purchased by another vendor and you want to keep track of all the historical payables transactions and combine them into one vendor. That's the tool you do that with, and it really can be done very quickly. So you will get a report that comes out of the system. Again, audit trail is up in the upper left corner. This vendor ID advanced has now been combined with Allenson, and there's your audit trail. Another purchasing tool is called the Vendor Modifier. The Vendor Modifier allows a person to change the name of the vendor, I'm sorry, not the name, but the vendor ID. So maybe Allenson used to be Allenson and now it was purchased by another company and it's called Beatrice, all one. Then I would go ahead and hit convert, and the vendor modifier is now finished. So instead of seeing Allenson, when you do a lookup, you're going to see Beatrice Foods. Okay, there's your report and your audit trail again. There's one more payables tool, purchasing tool, called the Vendor Name Modifier. As I mentioned before, each and every time there's a item pulled across the screen here that we're talking about and it's in yellow text, you cannot run that function without being logged in as a supervisor, and you must have all users logged out while this maintenance takes place. So the last one is Vendor Name Modifier. So under the Vendor Name Modifier, what you're literally doing is starting with a vendor here, and I just created one called Beatrice, but let's go with Attractive Telephone here. We'll use that, and I'll put them as AT&T Telephone, and I will go ahead and I'm going to use a standard I always use and capitalize everything for vendors, and let's just do like that. So I'll convert Attractive to AT&T Telephone, and the warning comes up again, Vendor Name Modifier is finished. And you will get another report for audit trail purposes that I changed Attractive Telephone to AT&T Telephone 01. So that is the end of the Purchasing Tools, Professional Service Tools Suite overview.